The
You
Casino Terrace
ate
restaurant in
my
Madrid was where the wealthy went to
dessert!
see
No,
and be seen.
I
That
didn't!
Sunday
Boys,
afternoon, Miguel
please,
Ortega,
not
40, a tech
here!
industry magnate,
That's
was having lunch with
enough,
his girlfriend
both
Cristina
of
Valdez
you.
and his
My
8-year-old son, Pablo.
dinner!
Everything seemed perfect: the sun, the wine, the steaming paellas. Then he appeared. David Garcia, 17, a part-time waiter in ripped jeans and worn-out sneakers, came running across the terrace and shouted something that stopped every conversation cold. "Your girlfriend put something in your son's food." His trembling finger pointed at Cristina, his eyes filled with terror. Miguel froze. Pablo had already raised his fork to his mouth. Cristina went pale. Then she smiled with icy calm. And in those suspended seconds, before anyone could move or speak, a truth began to unfold that would destroy lives, reveal deadly secrets, and prove that sometimes heroes come from the most unlikely places. Miguel Ortega wasn't used to public scenes. His life was built on control, perfection, and immaculate appearances. At 40, he had built a tech empire from scratch, appeared on the cover of Forbes Spain, owned a mansion in La Moraleja, and had a penthouse overlooking the royal palace. After his devastating divorce from Elena 3 years earlier, he had sworn never to marry again. Then he met Cristina. Cristina Valdez was everything a man like Miguel could want. 35, blonde, elegant, with a master's degree in economics from Complutense University and a mysterious past she revealed with calculated restraint. They had met at a charity gala 6 months earlier. She had fascinated him with her intelligence, beauty, and carefully dosed vulnerability. Within 3 months, they were officially dating. Within 6, Miguel was considering proposing. But there was a problem. Pablo, the 8-year-old son Miguel had with Elena, couldn't stand Cristina. The boy was silently hostile, refusing to speak to her, turning away when she tried to hug him, throwing tantrums when Miguel suggested Cristina move in with them. Miguel had attributed this behavior to Pablo not having processed the divorce yet, to seeing Cristina as a replacement for his mother. The child psychologists he consulted told him to give it time. That Sunday afternoon at Casino Terrace was supposed to be different. Miguel had chosen Madrid's most elegant restaurant. He'd reserved the best table on the terrace overlooking Gran Via. He'd ordered all of Pablo's favorite dishes. The idea was to create a happy memory, a moment when Pablo would finally see Cristina for who she really was, someone who loved him and wanted to be part of his life. At first, it seemed to work. Pablo was more relaxed than usual, maybe because they were in public. Cristina was at her best, smiling, attentive, telling funny stories that even Pablo seemed to appreciate. The food arrived. Paella for Pablo, sirloin for Miguel, mushroom risotto for Cristina. The golden afternoon sun made everything perfect. For the first time in months, Miguel felt optimistic. Cristina excused herself to go to the bathroom. Pablo played with Miguel's phone. The restaurant hummed with whispered conversations and the clinking of glasses. No one noticed the boy approaching from the back through the service area. No one except Pablo, who looked up and saw something that made him shudder. David Garcia was 17 and had been working part-time as a dishwasher at Casino Terrace for 6 months. He was a thin kid with dark hair that was too long, jeans that were ripped not by fashion but by wear, and sneakers that had seen better days. He came from Vallecas, one of Madrid's poorest neighborhoods. He worked to help his sick mother and pay for night school. He'd never spoken to customers. He was always invisible in the kitchen. But that Sunday afternoon, as he carried dirty dishes through the terrace, he saw something that made him stop. Cristina Valdez, the beautiful blonde woman at the corner table, had returned from the bathroom. But before sitting down, while the man and the boy were distracted, she did something strange. She took something from her purse, a small vial, and quickly poured the contents into the boy's plate of paella, mixing it with his fork in a movement so fast and practiced that only someone watching directly would have noticed. David noticed. Time slowed down. David saw the boy pick up his fork, bring it toward the plate. He saw the woman sit down with a perfect smile. He saw the man in the expensive jacket laugh at something. And without thinking, without calculating the consequences, without considering that he was about to destroy his already precarious life, David dropped the plates he was holding. The noise was deafening. 100 heads turned. And David ran toward the table, crossing the terrace, his trembling finger pointing at Christina, shouting with a voice that came from somewhere deep inside. "Your girlfriend put something in your son's food. I saw everything. Don't let him eat it." The silence that followed was total. Every conversation stopped. Every fork hung suspended. Miguel looked at David as if he were crazy. Then he looked at Christina, who had gone white as paper. Then he looked at Pablo, who held his fork with a mouthful of paella just inches from his mouth. For a second, no one moved. Then 3 things happened simultaneously. Miguel reached out and snatched the fork from Pablo's hand. Christina shot up, her chair falling behind her. And the restaurant manager, a bald man in a tuxedo, came running toward David with fury in his eyes. Chaos erupted. The manager grabbed David's arm, shouting that he was fired, that he was crazy, that he would call the police. David tried to explain, words pouring out in a desperate torrent. But who would believe a 17-year-old dishwasher over a woman like Christina Valdez? Christina, recovering her composure, laughed. An incredulous, perfect, practiced laugh. She turned to Miguel with eyes shining with controlled tears. "It was absurd," she said. "A kid, probably on drugs or mentally disturbed, accusing her of who knows what. She hadn't done anything. She'd gone to the bathroom, she'd come back, she'd sat down. That was it. It was terrifying to be accused like this in public." Miguel looked between David and Christina. Logic told him to believe Christina. He'd known her for 6 months. She was his girlfriend. This kid was a perfect stranger who had just destroyed a peaceful lunch. But something in David's eyes, that authentic terror, that total desperation, made him hesitate. And then Pablo spoke. In a small, trembling voice, he said something that stopped everything. "Dad, I saw it too. While you were looking at your phone. She put something in my plate." Miguel's world flipped. Christina denied it immediately, more forcefully, almost hysterical. It was impossible. Pablo must be mistaken. He was 8 years old. How could he be sure? Maybe he saw a shadow, a reflection. But Miguel looked into his son's eyes and saw the truth. The police arrived within 15 minutes. Miguel, using all the weight of his name and influence, insisted they analyze Pablo's plate. Christina protested, declared herself offended, threatened legal action. But when the officers asked to search her purse, something in her face changed. A micro-expression of panic that Miguel, who had spent 20 years reading people's faces in business, didn't miss. In Christina's purse, they found a small, empty vial of dark glass with liquid residue. Christina said it was perfume. But when the officers smelled it and held it up to the light, it was clearly not perfume. They took Pablo's plate and the vial for analysis. They took Christina in for questioning. Before being escorted out, Christina looked at Miguel with eyes that were no longer those of the woman he thought he knew. There was rage there, and something darker, cold, calculating, lethal. And Miguel understood with a horror that froze his blood. He had never really known this woman. He had no idea who Christina Valdez actually was. The restaurant was evacuated. Miguel sat with Pablo and David at a corner table while the police asked questions. Pablo was in shock. He was trembling. Miguel held him tight, whispering that everything was okay, that he was safe. But he kept looking at David, this kid in worn-out clothes with a thin face, who had just saved his son's life. David was terrified. He kept asking if he was in trouble, if he'd be arrested, if he'd lose his job. Miguel, with sudden clarity, told him he wasn't in trouble, he owed him his son's life. He asked his name, where he lived, why he worked there. And listening to David's story. Sick mother, absent father, night school, part-time jobs just to survive, Miguel felt something shift in his chest. The test results came back 2 days later. The liquid in the vial was digitalis, a heart medication that in concentrated doses is lethal, especially for a child. There had been enough in Pablo's plate to cause cardiac arrest within an hour. Cristina Valdez was arrested for attempted murder. The investigation revealed the devastating truth. Cristina wasn't who she claimed to be. Her real name was Cristina Morales. She had a history of fraud, of marriages to wealthy men, of mysterious inheritances. 3 years earlier, she had been a suspect in the death of her previous husband, a Valencia industrialist who had died of cardiac arrest. She was never convicted due to lack of evidence, but now, with the evidence of the attempt on Pablo, that case was reopened. Her plan had been simple and monstrous. Marry Miguel, eliminate Pablo in a way that would appear natural, inherit everything when Miguel himself died in a convenient accident a few years later. She was patient, methodical. She had played the long game. And she would have succeeded, if not for a 17-year-old kid working in the kitchen who had his eyes in the right place at the right time. Miguel couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the scene, Pablo with the fork near his mouth, Cristina smiling, David shouting. He realized with growing horror how blind he had been. The signs had been there, Pablo's hostility, Cristina's questions about his will, the way she pushed to get married quickly. How had he not seen it? But more than anything, he thought about David. A 17-year-old kid who had risked everything, his job, his reputation, possible arrest, to save a child he didn't know. Not for heroism, not for reward, but because it was the right thing to do. Miguel, who had spent 20 years in a world where everyone wanted something, where every action had a price, was completely disarmed by the pure decency of this kid. A week after the incident, Miguel went looking for David. He found the address in Vallecas, a dilapidated building where paint peeled from the walls and graffiti told stories of neglect. He climbed to the 4th floor without an elevator, his expensive shoes incongruous on the cracked cement steps. David opened the door, surprised. Behind him was a tiny apartment, clean but desperately poor. A woman in her 50s, visibly ill, sat on a worn-out sofa. David's mother. Miguel introduced himself and saw panic cross David's face. He thought he was in trouble. He thought Miguel was there to demand something. Instead, Miguel said something David didn't expect. He said he'd come to thank him. He said David had saved his son from a monster he himself had brought into their lives. He said he owed him a debt he could never repay. Then he made an offer that left David and his mother speechless. He wanted to help. He wanted to pay for David's mother's medical expenses. He wanted to make sure David could finish school without having to work part-time. He wanted to offer him a future. Not out of charity, Miguel insisted, but because it was fair. Because David deserved it. Because if the roles were reversed, he would want someone to do the same for his son. David refused. With a dignity that touched Miguel more than he could have imagined. David said he'd only done what anyone should do. He didn't want money. He didn't want charity. He just wanted Pablo to be okay. Miguel respected this, but he didn't give up. He said if David changed his mind, if he or his mother needed anything at all, he only had to call. But then David's mother, Rosa, spoke. In a weak but firm voice, she told her son that pride was one thing, but stupidity was another. This man was offering help. David was working like a donkey, sleeping 4 hours a night, destroying his future to keep her alive. She didn't want that. She wanted her son to have a chance. David looked at his mother, then at Miguel. And something in his face broke. The tears he'd held back for years, the exhaustion, the fear, all came out in that moment. He nodded, unable to speak. Miguel shook the kid's hand and felt something in that grip he hadn't felt in years. Genuine human connection, not based on business or advantage, but on something deeper. The months that followed transformed everyone's lives. Rosa Garcia received the medical care she needed. David stopped working at the restaurant and focused on school. His grades went up. His prospects opened up. But more than that, something unexpected happened. The two families merged. It started with Pablo asking to see David. The boy was traumatized by the incident. He had nightmares, fear of eating. But for some reason, talking to David calmed him down. David had a way of being with Pablo that was simple, honest, without the complicated psychology adults tried to impose. He talked to him like an equal, told him the truth, made him laugh with stories from his absurd life in Vallecas. Miguel began inviting David and Rosa over for dinner. At first it was awkward, the gap between their worlds so obvious. But Rosa had a wisdom that impressed Miguel, a perspective on life that money couldn't buy. And David had a natural intelligence that Miguel recognized immediately. The kid was brilliant. He read voraciously. He understood complex concepts with ease. One day, Miguel made another offer. He wanted David to consider university. Not just any university, the best ones. He'd pay for everything. David could study whatever he wanted, become whoever he wanted. David's reaction was first disbelief, then fear, then something that looked like hope. But there was more. As they spent time together, Miguel realized something. David filled a space in Pablo's life that had been empty since Elena left. Not as a father, not as a substitute, but as an older brother, a mentor, a friend. And Pablo, who had resisted every other relationship since the divorce, opened up completely to David. The turning point came one night when Pablo said something during dinner that stopped everyone. He looked at David and said he wanted him to be his real brother. Not fake, not just a friend, family. The room fell silent. David looked like he might cry. Rosa put her hand on her heart. And Miguel felt something he hadn't felt in years, the sense that his family, broken by divorce and nearly destroyed by Cristina, was healing in a way he'd never imagined. Miguel talked to his lawyers. Adopting a 17-year-old was complicated, but not impossible, especially when the kid had a mother who supported the decision, and when the adopter had Miguel's resources. Rosa, with tears of gratitude and sadness mixed, said she wanted this. She wanted her son to have opportunities she could never give him. She wasn't losing him, she was gaining an extended family. The adoption process took 8 months. During that time, David moved into Miguel's mansion. He had his own room, his own space, but he was part of the family. He helped Pablo with homework. He had dinner with them. He discussed technology and business with Miguel, showing insights that surprised him. And slowly, the house that had been so cold and empty after Cristina filled with warmth and laughter. Rosa visited every weekend. She watched her son flourish, watched him study without the obsession of working for money, watched him relaxed for the first time in years. And though a part of her felt the loss, the larger part rejoiced. Her son had won the lottery of life. Not with numbers, but with character. He'd been in the right place, done the right thing, and karma had answered. Cristina Morales's trial was followed by all of Spain. The media called it the Black Widow of Madrid case. The evidence was overwhelming, the digitalis, the testimony, the history of fraud and suspicious deaths. But Cristina hired the best lawyers that stolen money could buy. She fought with every legal weapon. During the trial, darker and darker details emerged. Cristina had killed at least 3 men over the course of 10 years. All wealthy. All married to her for brief periods. All dead under circumstances that seemed natural but now showed her mark. She was a calculating psychopath who saw people as means to an end. She had studied each victim, learned their weaknesses, played the perfect role until she got what she wanted. Miguel had to testify. He told of their relationship, of how she had seduced him, manipulated him, deceived him. He had to publicly admit how blind he'd been. But the most powerful testimony came from David. The kid, now 18, took the stand and told exactly what he'd seen that day. His honesty, his simplicity, the fact that he was clearly just a normal kid who'd done the right thing, impressed the jury more than any forensic evidence. Christina was sentenced to 30 years for attempted murder, and the cases of the previous deaths were reopened. It was over. The monster who had nearly destroyed Miguel's family was in prison. But the scars remained. Pablo still had nightmares. Miguel woke up in cold sweats, thinking how close he'd come to losing his son. And David, who had saved them all, carried the weight of having seen pure evil face to face. But after the trial, something changed. It was as if closing that chapter allowed everyone to truly move forward. Miguel started laughing again. Pablo went back to being the lively kid he'd been before the divorce. And David, free from the need to work to survive, flourished in ways no one had predicted. 2 years after that terrible day at Casino Terrace, much had changed. David had finished high school with excellent grades and been accepted to the Polytechnic University of Madrid to study computer engineering. Rosa lived in a comfortable apartment near Miguel's mansion, her health remarkably improved with proper care. Pablo was 10 and inseparable from David, who was now legally his brother. But the biggest change was in Miguel himself. His experience with Christina had transformed him. He'd learned to look beyond appearances, to value character over status, to recognize that a person's true worth isn't measured in money or pedigree, but in actions. He'd learned this lesson in the hardest possible way, but he'd learned it. One afternoon, Miguel took Pablo and David to Casino Terrace. It was their first time back since that day. The manager, the same one who had grabbed David to fire him, received them with shame and respect. He offered the best table, free wine, whatever they wanted. Miguel gently declined. They just wanted to have lunch as a normal family in the place where their story had changed. They sat at the same table. Pablo ordered paella, like that day. But this time, when the plate arrived, there was no fear. Just a happy kid eating paella with his father and his brother. David, now in new jeans and decent sneakers, but still with the same humility, looked around and seemed almost unable to believe how much his life had changed. Miguel raised his glass in a toast. He said that 2 years ago, in this very place, he'd almost lost everything, but he'd also gained everything. He'd almost lost his son, but he'd gained another son. He'd almost married a monster, but he'd found a real family. He'd learned that heroes don't always wear capes or come from castles. Sometimes they come from vallecas in ripped jeans with pure hearts. David blushed, but smiled. Pablo raised his glass of lemonade with adult seriousness. And the three of them toasted not just to family, but to something deeper, to human connection, to the courage to do the right thing even when it costs everything, to the truth that sometimes the worst moments bring the best changes. After lunch, as they walked along Gran Via with the Madrid sun painting everything gold, Pablo walked between the two men who loved him, holding both their hands. And Miguel, watching his son laugh at something David had said, realized something profound: family wasn't just blood. It was choice. It was who showed up when everything fell apart. It was a 17-year-old kid who risked everything to shout the truth on a terrace full of strangers. David enrolled at the Polytechnic, but chose to keep living at home with Miguel and Pablo instead of moving into the dorms. He said after years of loneliness and struggle, he wanted to enjoy having a family. Miguel couldn't agree more. The mansion that had once been just an expensive house was now a real home, full of voices and laughter and arguments about homework and video games and the future. Rosa had dinner with them at least 3 times a week. She'd developed a special relationship with Pablo, becoming the grandmother figure he'd been missing. And watching the 4 of them, eating together, laughing, arguing, just being a family, no one would have guessed that only 2 years earlier, they'd been perfect strangers, brought together by a horrible crime. The story spread. The media turned it into legend, the poor kid who saved the rich man's son and was adopted, a modern fairy tale. But those inside knew it wasn't a fairy tale. It was something more real, more complex, more beautiful. It was the chaos of life, sometimes, rarely, aligning perfectly to create something miraculous. Miguel often thought about Christina, now in prison for the next 3 decades. He thought about how close he'd come to catastrophe. But then he'd look at David helping Pablo with math, or hear their laughter from the garden, and he knew that from the worst nightmare had come the greatest gift. 2 sons instead of 1, a family instead of loneliness, hope instead of cynicism. And David, the kid who had only wanted to do the right thing, who hadn't sought reward or recognition, now had a brilliant future ahead of him. But more importantly, he had a family who loved him not for what he'd done, but for who he was. He had a little brother who adored him. A father who respected him. A mother who was proud of him. He hadn't won the lottery. He'd won something better. Life, with integrity and courage. The terrace at Casino Terrace became their special place. Every year, on the anniversary of that day, they returned for lunch, not to commemorate the near disaster, but to celebrate the birth of their family. And every year, ordering that paella that was never eaten, they toasted to life, to fate, and to the power of one brave kid who had shouted the truth when no one else would have. Like if you believe that true heroes come from the most unexpected places. Comment if you've ever done, or seen someone do, the right thing despite the cost. Share this story to remember that a single act of courage can change lives. Subscribe for more stories that prove human decency can triumph over evil. Sometimes the person who saves your life isn't who you expect. They don't come with titles or wealth. They show up in worn-out jeans with a pure heart. And if you're wise enough to recognize the gift, you don't just accept the rescue, you embrace the rescuer. Because in the end, real family isn't the one you're born into. It's the one you choose. And the strongest bonds aren't forged in blood, but in the fire of crisis, when someone shows you they're willing to risk everything to do what's right.